Good evening, everyone. This is a live session for the course Indian Fiction and English run by NPTL. We hope that this session will ensure some good interaction and will also provide you a forum for raising some of your concerns and some of your questions. And I will begin by responding to some of the significant questions and concerns being raised by you in the forum and also through other means. I realize that there is a dearth of material which most of you are facing as part of the course material which is being circulated. We regret the fact that we are unable to share the scanned material with you because there are copyright issues. And I advise and encourage you to access these works, the novels as well as the secondary material, from a nearby library, or whenever it is affordable for you, you can even buy a copy of your own. But at this point, we are unable to share scanned material with you because most of the material, including the novels and the other additional reading material, we are all under copyright laws. And how do you deal with this challenge while you're going through this course? As far as possible, we've tried to cover the additional material quite extensively. Of course, the summaries of the novels are not provided, but there are detailed presentations given in the form of lectures, in the form of student presentations, which would help you engage with the number of novels which are part of this course. And there is a broad range, as you can see, in the kind of novels and the number of novels that are part of this course. We begin by looking at one of the earliest novels, Rajmohan's Wife, which is considered as a first proper novel to be written in English. And this was in the 19th century. We have not based an extensive discussion on that novel, but we do share some important insights, particularly from the critical point of view of the contemporary. And then with Canto Para, written in the 1930s, we begin a solid discussion of Indian fiction produced in English. And from then on till the latest novel by Alan Seeley's Aldinus, there's a wide range of texts that we have tried to cover. There is, it is difficult to say whether we've been able to cover all important texts, because in any course, that would be rather impossible given the time frame within which we work. This is also a 12-week course with roughly about 30 hours of teaching. So we've tried to include representative texts from each age, from the 1930s onwards. And as a rationale for selecting particular texts, we have used the general guidelines provided by various forces at work, like literary histories or critical tradition, the way in which syllabi and curricula are structured in Indian universities, the significance of these works in the overall understanding of Indian literature. We've taken into consideration many of these facts for including these set of texts. And among the texts which we discuss, almost all the texts are readily available, except for one or two. One is Alan Seeley's Trottenama, which would be a little difficult for you to procure. And we have given an extensive discussion of the text, while we also regret that we are unable to make the novel available for you. We do have a question coming in from Rini Sultana. Is it required to read all the novels mentioned in the syllabus? So I do understand that we have a wide range of texts, but some of those texts are meant for more detailed reading. So the way the lectures are structured, depending on the number of hours dedicated for each text, you will be able to make this distinction of which text is more important than the others. We will also be sending out a note to all of you about the texts which are meant for detailed study and the texts which are meant as additional resources that would also perhaps equip you better in preparing for the exams at a later point. And we've kept this list rather vast and expansive, so as to try and include as many novels as possible, as many novels which are discussed in different universities across the world, wherever Indian literature is taught, wherever Indian writing in English is taught. These are the different. It always falls within this range. The selection falls within this range. So we have tried to include as many as possible in that sense. So, for instance, there are certain novels which cannot be excluded at all. For instance, the first novel, Canto Para, then the novels which are being considered as significant in the post 80s, Rushdie's Midnight Children, of course, the Shadow Lines, yeah, and work such as The Hungry Tide, which also talks about Indian, which also addresses the elements of fiction in a different way altogether. So there are certain works which cannot be excluded at all. Apart from that, some works such as, say, Waiting for the Mahatma or Cry the Peacock, they could be seen as novels which are part of additional reading. Yeah, we may not make that compulsory, Wendy, for your final exam. Those things which will be described and announced in detail to you at a later point before the exams itself. But the point in including this vast range of novels is also to enable to survey this larger critical tradition as part of Indian writing in English. If you've been following the lectures, you would also realize that there's a continuity in the literary tradition, which we always try to address. It is not really about the kind of stories that Raja Rao narrated or at a later point Rushdie narrated, but our focus is to see how, in the context of the nation, certain continuities and certain connections can be traced. Yeah. There's another question from Abhishek Samal. Ma'am, I've got all the books. Some of them I had read earlier. However, Trottanama is unavailable on the online website. So yes, Trottanama is a text which is not available. It's a text which is out of print, and there are no e-copies available either. So we are not making it as a compulsory reading at all for that same reason. But I thought a lecture focusing on Trottanama is extremely important, given the significance this text has in this oeuvre of Indian English fiction. And this is also a text which is said to be at par with Midnight's Children for different historical reasons. It didn't really become as huge as Midnight's Children for various reasons known and unknown. But yes, it is. This text is not available currently, and we also regret that we are unable to help in any way, because though we have certain, even if someone may have a copy available, it'd be difficult to make it available to the public for copyright reasons. There's a question about how we can answer the descriptive questions in the exam and give us certain instances of the questions so that we can prepare. And not just from the examination point of view, I think the focus on written skills is something you should begin to practice. Maybe at the end of every lecture, at the end of every session, you can start practicing and identifying certain questions from that and practicing writing a paragraph or a short essay. And if we talk about sample questions, some of the commonplace regular questions would be let's say the use of magic realism in Midnight's Children, or the way caste figures in a novel like The God of Small Things. Yeah? So the questions would be mostly based on themes. This is not going to be the descriptive question is not going to be a place where we test the memory of your reading of the novel. The intention will be to test whether you have understood the broad themes and whether you are able to put them in the context of criticism, in the context of the larger literary tradition, yeah, and whether you're able to see the connections and see how the particular novel is situated in this larger body of writing. And about practicing your writing skills, I think that's something that you all need to uh, focus upon, because some of the times when we get back the written script after the final exam, the way the answers are framed, it comes across as being quite disappointing. It could be because you did not have enough practice writing things out. Maybe you thought it is a skill which would come to you naturally. But I also take this opportunity to tell you that among all these skills of reading, writing, and speaking, the most difficult one is writing. So take up this challenge of writing a short note after every lecture to see how well you are able to imbibe everything, how well you are able to grasp and comprehend everything. And more importantly, are you able to articulate and write down well what you have understood? I think that is something which will come to you through a lot of practice. Is there any way to access sample papers so that we can practice these questions? We are thinking of opening out the forum along with the assignments to enable you to send us some written answers. They're not going to be graded, but you can practice writing them, and whenever possible, we will be providing you with feedback as well. So maybe halfway through the course, we will begin this process of sending out some sample questions so that you can begin to attempt them on your own. And if you prefer to send this to us, you can do that as well. And in the forum, we will also be periodically sending a set of questions which you can practice writing. There's a question about the paper. What will the full marks of the exam? How many descriptive questions will be there? The exam is for 100 marks. And about the exact nature of the paper, about the number of the question pattern and the details of that will be posted later in your forum. We will, of course, be sharing with you all the relevant details which are required for you to approach the exam. This will be done quite well in advance. Please keep checking the forum and the updates which are posted as announcements. And talking about this, the preparation for the exams, you need to be attentive to the assignment questions of every week. And in addition to that, pay very close attention to the things which are discussed as part of these lectures. And understanding your own familiarity with these individual texts, with these novels, will definitely help you to answer the questions in a better way. But even if you just follow these lectures, it should suffice from an examination point of view. But I understand that most of you are here, not just from an examination point of view, also want to do a little more with this body of writing. So I encourage you to focus on, say, a handful of texts, say 5 or 6 novels, and then see how well you have understood those novels and the readings which are circulated as part of that. So that will be one useful exercise that you can initiate on your own, and try writing out critical essays based on your reading. Access additional material wherever needed, and also bring in your own reading and your own understanding to frame an argument, to say how things, to show how things have emerged. For instance, if you are talking about a novel like Canto Para, the conventional historical understanding, the canonical approach towards the novel Canto Para is more or less monolithic, if one could call it so. The canonical conventional approach is not attentive to the many absences in Canto Para, It talks about Canto Para being this perfect microcosm of the Indian nation, how Rajarao could capture every single emotion which was part of the Ganthian movement. There is no space for an alternate discussion. We don't find the figures of history, such as Ambedkar, figuring in there along with Gandhi. So these are some of the subtle nuances that you need to be attentive to when you are doing this course, because your own critical element, your own critical contribution will come in only when you realize that Canto Para is not just about Gandhi and the many things related to Indian national movement. It is also about a particular way of projecting Indian history, Indian nationalist movement. It's also about the absences in terms of caste, in terms of the Ambedkarite movement. Yeah. So these additional readings will help you to situate every work within a larger historical context. Is there any way to get the transcripts of the classes? Yes, currently I think the transcripts are not available, but it will be soon made available to you. I am not too sure about the timeline of when the transcripts will be made available to you, but meanwhile, it's a good idea to keep listening to the lectures and take notes of them. That is going to be more useful than having an entire set of ready-made material with you. And if you find that some of the reading material are not accessible, or due to certain time constraints you are not able to access them, yeah, again pay attention to the points which are being covered in the lecture, and try and read at least a handful of novels as and when you progress through this course. And if and when you are not able to read an entire novel, focus on certain segments which are being discussed. But again, you need to pay attention, a close attention to the lectures to cull out these significant aspects and these significant elements of different texts. So focusing on these on certain chapters or certain important segments will also be a useful way to take you through this course. That is, if and when you do not have the time to go through the entire novel. And one useful tip for reading the novels, if you there are some e-copies available online, which unfortunately we cannot share with you due to copyright reasons, but if you can access them on your own, it will be easy to read through any of the electronic devices. You can read them on the go, and it'll be easy to also identify particular segments which are useful for you as far as the understanding of this course is concerned. And again, coming back to this question of how to prepare for the exams, if you've been paying attention to the kind of assignment questions which are being given to you, the details of the novel, if and when asked, it's always part of the lecture as well. So we are not asking additional extra questions which are not covered as part of the lecture. While we assume that you will be doing your own reading, your own extra additional reading, we take special care not to ask any questions which are not covered in the lectures and the discussions. Okay, there is a question which says, in some previous sessions, the answers given by students to the questions asked by you in the class aren't audible. Could they be added later on in the video description in YouTube or in the forum? Yeah, thank you for pointing this out. Of course, this can be done. I understand that in a couple of lectures, the responses given by the students or the questions they asked were not that audible. We will certainly be posting this in the forum or in the YouTube link as an additional information. But I would also like to add that in most of the situations, we have taken care that you've not lost out on anything much. Either the question was repeated or the responses of the students were also incorporated into the main lecture which was given. As in, when you move on, when you progress with the course, you will also realize that you will have a series of presentations by the students. This is being done to show how it is possible to come up with your own interpretations by looking at a range of other critical responses. Most of these students, they have worked on one novel, and they have read the novel, the additional material, and they have tried to compress and compile everything in the form of a presentation. So that is one model that you can also perhaps practice on your own, to pick one or two novels and pick up topic for presentation, for discussion, and see how well you will be able to compile the various readings available and deliver them in the form of a presentation. Maybe you can get into groups if you are doing this course together as a group, and try making presentations in front of each other, which will also improve your presentation skills in addition to improving your comprehension, your power of organizing material and making it into a deliverable form. Yeah. Okay, there's a question. Is it true that most time Booker Prize is given to those authors who project the negative image of India? I am not too sure what is meant by negative image in this question. If you would like to clarify that, kindly do so. My response to that otherwise would be, if you take a look at a series of works which have won the Booker Prize, uh, whether it is Rushdie's Midnight's Children or Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, then we have Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss, and the latest Booker winner, The White Tiger by Aravinda Adiga. Of course, we have one more which was published a little earlier, that is by Ruth Pravar Chawbala, her work Heat and Dust. But she's usually not included among the Indians who won the Booker Prize because she was not an Indian technically. Yeah, if you've been paying attention to the discussions on Chawbala, you would have figured that out. So I personally do not subscribe to this view that the Booker Prize is given to those works which portray a negative image of India. In Rushdie, we discuss these novels case by case. In Rushdie's Midnight's Children, it's an alternative history of India. It is a work which is trying to showcase a lesser known story, which is trying to quite deliberately show you that there's a different idea of partition. There's a different story, or rather, a number of stories, fragmented histories, which need to be taken into account when one is looking at the history of the nation or the history of partition. I wouldn't know whether that is a negative image. Yeah. The moment you begin addressing uncomfortable truths or facts, the moment you begin to encounter certain discomforting images, it would be very mature to say that it's a negative portrayal. And in the case of Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, she did receive a lot of flack after the publication because this novel was critiquing two important things. One was communism, the other was caste. And both these things were done from within the fold of Christianity. So it was a different ball game altogether. She had taken out certain elements which were considered as commonsensical and conventional in the context of this nation, and she had tried to critique that. There are very uncomfortable things which are being discussed over there in the context of caste. For instance, the link that she makes visible, the link that she identifies between, say, caste and communism, between caste and Christianity, these could be very discomforting. But at the same time, it is important to address these different dichotomies, these ambivalent situations in the society. I wouldn't think that that's a negative portrayal, because one also need to be attentive to these various voices which are not very comforting to us, which are not very soothing to us in terms of telling this the right story of the nation, the appropriate story of the nation. If you come to the Arvind Adiga's White Tiger, it's a he's not talking about the nation in the way that Rushdie or Arundhati Roy did. He is talking about this nation in the aftermath of globalization and commercialization. He is talking about how these multiple possibilities which are being opened out need not necessarily present before you a set of moral choices alone. He's talking about this ruthless protagonist who is willing to go to any extent, even to the point of committing a murder, in order to make it big. So it would be again rather naive to say that these works got the Booker awards, Booker prizes, only because of they were willing, only because they were willing to portray a negative image. One could have various debates and differences of opinion about the relative merit which is part of each of these works. And of course, as a point of debate, this can be raised whether there's a negative image being portrayed. But focusing on that element alone to see that this is also an extension of the colonial agenda, that may need some more discussion. That's what I would say. In the case of all kinds of prizes, we find that there is politics at work, whether it's a Sahitya Academy Award or the Booker Prize or perhaps the Nobel Prize. There is a politics at work as part of canon creation, as part of acknowledging the articulations from one community or the other. Those things are undeniable, they are inevitable. But for a constructive debate to take place, I think it is better to approach this topic with a rather non-judgmental, from a rather non-judgmental position, and to see whether there is any merit in the arguments which are being put forward. There were, of course, certain writers who were always kept away, kept out of the canon, kept out of the commonplace discussion because they were not very kind in the way they wrote about India. V.S. Naipaul being one of those writers. He also had recently now passed away. Naipaul had won a Nobel Prize, as you know. He was ethnically, he's an Indian, but he's not had any lived experience in India. His family, a generation back, had migrated to Trinidad and Tobago. But we find that locating himself in the Caribbean and later in the West, he is trying to talk about an India about which he knows only through the exotic images presented by the West. That was not taken very kindly, and we have not discussed Naipaul in detail in this course at all. But of course, there are certain writers who were not included as part of this oeuvre because they had presented the image of India in a very unkindly fashion. This is not to say that all these writers, say from Rushdie till Roy and Adiga, they all enjoy a very favorable position. We know about the controversies that were part of Rushdie and his work, how a fatwa was issued to him after the publication of Satanic Verses. We know about there were these public interest litigations filed against Arundhati Roy because certain readers felt that she had offended the sensibilities of certain communities. So these things are also there. But as an informed reader, as an informed critique, Our position not of should not be from a judgmental one, but it should be from a position of more informed as well as secular and free criticism, where one is open to the idea that there are alternate stories and there are alternate images of the nation which are getting projected in many of these works. Just because it is not in alignment with the way I look at the story of the nation, just because it is not in alignment with the way I situate the dominant politics of the nation, it should not be seen as negative. And throughout the early stage of Indian English fiction, we also find that there's a stark way in which there's a very marked way in which Ambedkar is kept out of all the discussions on nationalism. It's as if the International Congress is seen as the only institution, only system which is spearheading this vast movement of international movement, of the Indian nationalist movement. But we also know about the many contributions made by, say, figures like Ambedkar or Phule, and how they are systematically kept out of this discussion, out of the plot structure, out of the storyline, for various reasons, known and unknown. And if an inclusion of those things, if an inclusion of those less visible, more or less forgotten things are made possible, there is every possibility that someone or the other may find it offensive or incorrect or negative, but that need not be used as an excuse to justify certain absences, justify the gaps which are present in this body of writing. Is that the question? What are the best books to know the critical perspectives of Indian writing, Indian English fiction? Again, it's difficult to pinpoint one book as such which would provide a critical perspective on Indian English fiction as a whole. If you Google or if you go through a set of collections in the library, you'll realize that there are different ways in which Indian English fiction is being written about. There's a lot of secondary material which is getting produced. One good way of identifying best books or reliable books would be to go for some reputed, peer-reviewed publishers. Go for the works which are subscribed by university as part of university curricula. Go for the works which have received commendable reviews from other critical masters of this body of writing, and prepare a set of a list of writers in this sense. That should be the kind of approach that you make, rather than focusing on one book which will give a critical perspective to understand this entire body of writing. If you are, say, for instance, trying to look at the critical material available on Midnight's Children, maybe you should start looking at some introductory work on Midnight's Children. And then, to get an idea about the critical writings, look at works which explore in detail the various approaches, say a post-colonial approach, or a work which talks about the hybridity in Midnight's Children, something which talks about how Salim Sinai's life can be equated to the progressive life of the nation. Yeah, look for specific things so that you also get to know how those specific things are engaged with from multiple points of view. But you would also come across certain texts such as Cry the Peacock, on which there is very little credible material available. So we do have a student presenting on Cry the Peacock, and I think she did share this difficulty of getting good material, good reliable material to understand the text. Yeah? So those also need to be factored in while you are looking for critical perspectives, some works will be overworked, and on certain works you may not even find sufficient material to get some foundational ideas of it. um, and continuing with these questions, though this is unscrupulous to ask, can you please suggest which writers are more important, whose all works one should read from the next exam point of view? I wish I could answer this, but I'm in no position to comment on what questions would come on net. I'm not the one who's setting the question paper. So this would be very hard for me to say which writer is more important than the other. But from the experience of having prepared for net at an earlier point and seen the way in which these kinds of exams are being organized, I think there's a pattern you can begin to identify. It's up. I understand the earnestness with which these questions are being raised, but it would be totally misleading if I tell you that this is important or that is important, because one would never know. That's an exam. The whole point of an exam is to test if you are prepared to deal with different kinds of questions. Having said that, I think it's a good idea to go through the previous question papers and to see if there is a pattern that you can see being repeated. And again, I say this with a lot of caution. The general understanding in setting a question paper for UGC NET exam is that they should be covering the texts which are taught in most Indian universities. So what I have the rationale, one of the rationales for choosing these texts as part of this course is like I've tried to bring in as many texts as possible on the basis of how they're covered in different Indian universities. So, yeah, this is a hard question to answer, but nevertheless, if you are familiar with representative text, if you are familiar with representative text from each age, I think more or less you would be in a safe position. But again, one cannot say how representative one can get as far as each age is concerned, because there is a number of works which are being produced in each decade. Yeah. And and also, as I said, maybe it's a good idea to go through the previous question papers and see if there are patterns that you can identify. And yes, so the theory of defamiliarization be applied to the character of Gandhi in Waiting for Mahatma? If yes, can you please elucidate? It is, in fact, yes and no. Gandhi, of course, is being projected in Waiting for the Mahatma as a different kind of a character in comparison with the Gandhi in, say, Untouchable or in Canto Para. But the historical context also needs to be kept in mind. The historical context in terms of publication. Waiting for the Mahatma is a later text. It's published in the 1950s. It's not a 1930s text. But we do discuss these three texts together because we have the image of Gandhi, the figure of Gandhi in it. Being alert to this transition is one way to understand how Gandhi is being projected. Of course, compared to Canto Para, which looks like a more realistic portrayal of Gandhi. But again, one would not know whether that's a realistic thing or not, because we did talk about how there were a lot of legends and a lot of assumptions about Gandhi's character, and how that also had influenced a lot of writers. And there were certain expectations from the reader about the figure of Gandhi, which these writers also tried to meet. So in that sense, yes, it is a defamiliarized depiction of Gandhi, though I'm unsure of how the theory can be directly applied over there. It is a different kind of a projection of Gandhi. But given the historical context, which is the 1950s, where Gandhi begins to be seen as not as this larger than life figure. There are people talking about the many limitations of the Gandhian ways. Yeah? So it's also one way in which perhaps Mulk Rajanan tries to see how these different approaches can be brought together, how this different way of projecting Gandhi can be presented within this body of fiction. About can we have live sessions more frequently? I think the response for this will be certainly provided in the forum. And of course, if you would like to have more live sessions, you can place a request for that. And I think it is possible to consider these requests for a later time. And coming back to an earlier, there is another question. In one of your earlier lectures, you talked about the Rushdie moment. Without that particular moment, would you say Indian writing would not be as popular or critically acclaimed globally? Let me take this question in a different way. If you would like to come up with this thesis that Rushdie was not the important moment, you would have a hard time arguing it out. Or if you are coming up with this hypothesis that if Rushdie had not happened, a series of writings, a series of literary moments, a series of plot structures which followed would not have happened. It's perhaps easier to argue the second one out because Rushdie is now canonically, historically, and in a literary way seen as the moment which changed the game of Indian fiction in English. But again, alternatively, if you want to downplay the Rushdie moment, it's hard for you to argue that case out. Given this situation, this hypothetical question is a little difficult to deal with. It's a little irrelevant because one would never know. Because no one is in a position to say for sure whether, say, Alan Seeley would have occupied that position or Amitav Ghosh would have occupied that position. It's very hard to say. But one significant thing that we cannot miss at all is that in the late 70s, there is a point of time when a number of critics are arguing collectively that maybe this is the end of Indian writing in English. There was a flowering at some point. This is all this nation could do. Now we have come to a dead end. There's this moment of impasse. You can't go any further than this. By 60s, 70s, we do not have any momentous writer being discussed. So after this pronouncement of death knell, which is what one of Uma Parameshwaran's essay refers to, after this pronouncement of a death knell on Indian fiction in English, we find this moment happening, this moment of Midnight Children. And it is important to say that it is a Rushdie moment because there were others writing during that time as well. There could be many things which worked in advantage of Rushdie, his location, his cosmopolitan outlook, the exposure that he had, the perhaps the knowledge that he had of the publishing industry and how to place his works in a more international context. There could be many, many things, but there's no denying the fact that there was this Rushdie moment which was at work. But of course, his first work that was almost a failure, Grimus, which was published before Midnight's Children, that didn't really make Rushdie famous at all. But the moment Rushdie got this book out, it changed not just Rushdie's future as a literary writer, but it changed the entire scene of post-colonial writing. And we have, when we talk about Rushdie, we also talk about how he is seen as this figure which inaugurated the moment of post-colonialism and postmodernism in the context of Indian writing. We also talk extensively about how he is said to have influenced the careers of a number of other younger writers who came in after him. So I wouldn't want to say that Indian writing would not be as popular or critically acclaimed globally if Rushdie had not happened. I wouldn't want to argue otherwise either, but because one would never know. And the amount of things, the critical things, reviews, the promotional events, the amount of things which have been talked about, written about Rushdie, about Midnight's Children, it is uncomparable. I don't think there's any other writer who could match up with that, whether we like Rushdie or not, whether we agree with the many things that he talks about in his work or not. There is no denying the fact that he made this moment of publication of Midnight Children as a Rushdie moment. It's a watershed event in Indian literary history. I wouldn't hesitate to say Indian literary history. It's not just the history of Indian fiction, because the kind of attention that the Indian writers writing in English began to get vis-a-vis the attention that the Bhasha writers got, yeah, the gap, the chasm between these two became very, very evident, very, very pronounced after the Rushdie moment. All of a sudden, we have the Indian writers writing in English. They have a lot of popularity, they have fame, they are making money, and they are there in the international literary scene as well. But if you take the case of the Bhasha writers, it's only after this moment, after the Midnight's moment, the 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 challenges and the limitations that they face as Bhasha writers, or the way in which they are not able to make it big, forget about that international scene, not even in the national scene, it becomes all the more pronounced. So this literary moment is extremely important. It is a defining Rushdie moment. We really can't think about the history of Indian writing in English without taking into account the significance or the contributions of this Rushdie moment. So we have a question on Canto Para. Can Canto Para be called an entirely historical novel? Again, it would be useful if you qualify this term entirely historical novel. This is seen as one of the earliest novels for sure. And when we talk about modern novels in the context of Indian writing in English, this is the first novel which gets discussed, the first novel to have had that kind of critical attention and popularity. And to say whether this can be called as an entirely historical novel, yes, to a very large extent, because what is being covered in Canto Para is largely the context of the Indian nationalist movement. And there's, of course, a way in which history slides into fiction. That's a marvelous phrase that Rumina Sethi uses to talk about Canto Para. History slides into fiction. You cannot take the fictional element out of those historical discussions, and you definitely cannot take history out of those fictional discussions. They are really intertwined. The link between both are quite inseparable. There are fictional characters, say, like Murthy. But Murthy's identity, Murthy's character attains its fullness in the context of his response and approach to Ganthierism. And there is Ganthier, who is a real historical character. We do not find Ganthier appearing as a character, but the presence of Ganthier as a historical figure, as a political figure, as an ideological figure, it's overwhelming to such an extent that if you ask who is the important character, whether Murthy or Ganthier, it's difficult to say. Of course, Murthy is the one who is executing whatever Ganthier desires, but Ganthier, it would not be wrong to say that Ganthier emerges as the important protagonist over there. Yeah, and of course, to a very large extent, it can be considered as a historical novel because the way history slides into fiction, that is the underlying, most important, the prominent element which comes through in Canto Para. Whether this is the authentic, the only available form of history, that is a thing which needs to be much contested. What is expected of us as students of literature preparing for research in the UGC net. Okay. Students of literature preparing for research. I'm glad that you asked this. I think if you are interested in pursuing research, it would be important to begin preparing yourself. It would be important to say, develop this skill of approaching even the subjects of your study from a critical research oriented point of view. One of the things that we like to impart as part of this course, Indian Fiction and English, to enable you to think critically and to enable you to broaden your research perspective, which is when you see a text, the significant thing is not just to look at what the storyline is. Of course, that is important, but that's only a starting point. Reading the novel and understanding the plot structure and knowing about the connections between the different characters and knowing the story, basically, that's only the starting point, perhaps just the first step or half a step. But in this course, at least, I encourage you to be attentive to the critical tradition in which this work is placed, the extra literary features that you need to be attentive to. Yeah? Those are the things which would perhaps add value to a research based question that you would like to ask at a later point. If let me take this example of Canto Para. Canto Para was seen as a historical novel which talks about the nationalist sentiments, which covers the microcosm of the nation. That was the approach towards Canto Para for a very long time. And then when we look at Rumina Sethi's work, which is Myths of the Nation, which is entirely based on Canto Para, and how Canto Para, and through Canto Para, she is addressing and critiquing a lot of nationalist issues. She is dismantling a lot of frameworks which were in place. So that is perhaps a contribution that she brings in as a researcher. If you would like to be able to do that kind of research and that kind of critique, you need to train yourself to be alert to the many extra literary things which are present in every work. For instance, if you are reading Untouchable, the most obvious thing to say is that Untouchable is about caste. But a research based, a critically trained question would be, what kind of caste is being presented over here? Does this have a certain ideological or political linkage to this? Or is this the way caste is understood in the contemporary? So those are certain questions that you could perhaps think about. And the second part of this question about what is expected when you prepare for UGC net. I think the exam pattern of UGC net has also undergone a lot of changes. It may keep undergoing changes. So maybe the best thing would be, as I said earlier, to be attentive to the question pattern and to see if there are certain kinds of questions which are being repeated. But in terms of expectations, ideally, a student of literature who is preparing oneself for the NET exam is expected to be familiar with this wide range of literary studies as part of English literature, Indian literature, as part of post-colonial writing. So the expectation, ideally, technically, is it's quite a formidable expectation. But this is again, a kind of an examination for which you can prepare. There are sample question papers available. There are different ways in which you can train yourself to engage with the. Nowadays, I think it's predominantly objective type questions. So perhaps, since you've precisely asked this question, maybe you're also expected to retain a lot of information, and that is something you need to train yourself by taking down notes and making useful charts, helpful charts, which will help you to see the connections across. Yeah. Yeah. There's another question. What makes a novel Ganthian? How can we differentiate Ganthian novel from other novels? Is it necessary to present Gandhi as a character or only make passing references to the movement? In the critical tradition, in a very canonical way, all the Ganthian novels, which are the novels which are being referred to as Ganthian, they all have Gandhi either as a character or Gandhi is an important presence. The Ganthian movement is an important presence in shaping the plot, in in making important decisions about how the plot moves ahead. For example, Canto Para, Waiting for the Mahatma, Untouchable. Yeah, these are some of the significant Ganthian novels. But in say in another work by, I'm trying to give you a different kind of an example. In a novel by Nayantara Segal, the novel is Rich Like Us. There is a Ganthian character, but conventionally, it's not categorized as a Ganthian novel because there's only a limited discussion bordering on critique about this Ganthian character. And the Ganthian figure is also projected as this ideal role model sort of a character. But nevertheless, it has not been characterized or labeled as Ganthian. And I also want you to be alert to the fact that these are labels given by certain critics and certain historians for the sake of convenience of looking at literary history and for the convenience of giving these useful labels. We tend to use them as well. So while most of these critics have referred to these works as being Ganthian, M.K. Naik, Srinivas Iyengar, C.D. Narasimhaya, they all have used this phrase Ganthian novels, Ganthian writings quite extensively. But they've not really spelled out what makes a novel more Ganthian than the others. Which is why we also talk about Snehal Shingavi's essay in one of those discussions, because he asked this question, what makes a novel more Ganthian than the others? And he also gives this very interesting example of how Srinivasa Iyengar, when he was writing in the early 40s, he did not really bother to give this category of Ganthian novels. There was no discussion of Gandhi or his influence in the literary scene. But when he publishes his work, when the later editions come on in the late 1950s and 60s, we realize that there are about 2.5 chapters devoted entirely to the discussion of Gandhi and Ganthian literature. So it's also a historical change which comes in, which needs to be taken into account when we talk about these specific labels. It is not possible to read, there's a concern, it's not possible to read all the novels discussed in the course between the lines. What should be the smart strategy to manage all these? Right, I think you should be able to come up with some strategies to engage with this. I agree that it may not be possible to read all the novels prescribed. So this is, if you some of you may not know that this is actually a course which is also run here at IIT Madras. We do have a set of students who are participants in this course. So this is a strategy that we use to deal with this in a classroom situation. There will be a wide range of texts which are prescribed. Some of the texts would be given as part of compulsory reading. So if you are doing this as an additional course to enhance your knowledge, then perhaps you can also think about some of the important texts, representative texts, to be classified as compulsory reading. If it is useful to post a list of works which are meant for compulsory reading and a few meant as additional reading, we will try to do that in a couple of weeks. So what we do in class is, apart from these compulsory readings, a novel would be assigned to different students. Different novels will be assigned to different students uh, for detailed study. So they will take it upon themselves to read the novel, undertake a close reading of the novel, and give presentations based on their understanding, and also including and incorporating uh, the other additional material that they come across. So I I think if you find it difficult to accommodate all of those readings together, maybe make yourself familiar with the discussions which are part of this course. Pay a close attention to all the lectures, which will give you a good idea about the frameworks that we discuss, which will give you a good idea about the critical tradition which is being accessed, and then make an informed choice as to which novel you would want to pursue in detail, which are the set of novels which you would want to pursue in detail. And I think there is one more question, perhaps that could be the last one that we could take due to time constraints. Rumina Sethi in her book mentioned double discourse of nationalism was hegemonizing and modernizing. What does these two terms mean? We may not have the time to go into these two terms in detail. I'll try and explain it in a very short way. So Rumina Sethi argues that nationalism works as two different kinds of forces. One is hegemonizing and the other is modernizing. Yeah. We'll look at the second term first, modernizing. The nationalist movement was also happening during a time when the nation was entering this phase of modernity. And we find that many of the reform movements were spearheaded by the internationalist leaders. There is a way in which a modern discourse for the nation, a modern idea for the nation is also built into this idea of nationalism. But this also became hegemonizing. Yeah? We could think about the example that we have used repeatedly in today's session, the dichotomy between Gandhi and Ambedkar. The way the discourse of nationalism gets talked about, Rumina Sethi argues, it becomes hegemonic when this nationalism focuses only on the figure of Gandhi, when it totally is it's almost dismissive of the contributions made by someone like Ambedkar, dismissive of the different kinds of nationalism which had emerged in different parts of the country, not always under the leadership of Gandhi or not always under the leadership of International Congress. So it becomes a hegemonizing force as well, while its contributions to the modernizing of the nation cannot be ignored. Yeah? To sum it up, there is this discourse of nationalism, which is important for our discourse on modernity, but the same discourse also begins to overpower and dismiss and diminish all the other alternative articulations and the other discourses which are also perhaps part of nationalism in one form or the other. I think we did have a useful, beneficial, and fruitful interaction in this live session today. I hope you've been able to raise and we've been able to address and respond to most of the queries raised. If you have further queries and further concerns, please feel free to write in the forum. We will try and respond and address them and, as soon as possible in whichever way we can. And about the dearth of materials, we are trying to see if we could, it would be helpful if we sent you a list of material to access. And we'll see if the transcripts can be made available very soon. These are certain things that we are definitely working on. So thank you for being a part of this session. Continue to have a fruitful learning experience, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.